In the last lesson, we discussed lexical definitions. And one of the points about lexical definitions was that it's the most descriptive of the definition types we talked about. So this type of definition is perhaps most subject to criticism. And a lexical definition can be just plain wrong, or it can be problematic in some other ways. Lesson 2.5 concerns problems and rules for lexical definitions. You'll find in the textbook 8 distinct rules for lexical definitions, and not all of those are equally significant in my opinion. Some of them we can sort of set aside more or less. Rule 1, that the definition should be grammatical, is nothing really special about definitions. Everything should be grammatical. So I don't want to worry about that too much. The second rule, that a definition should convey the essential meaning of the term being defined, is a significant rule about definitions. Actually, before we talk about the second rule, though, I think it's helpful to discuss the third rule actually first, and that is that the definition should be neither too broad nor too narrow. So now let's get into what is meant by too broad and too narrow. One common way of explaining this distinction is to say that a definition that's too broad includes too much, and a definition that's too narrow includes too little. I'm a little worried about that description, that it could be a little misleading. Let me give you an example to show you why. If I offer the definition that a cat is an animal, and then someone else offers a definition that a cat is a feline animal with stripes and green eyes, which of those definitions includes more? Now, you see, the problem is that if you're thinking of including more information, you might say the second one includes more. But if you're thinking in terms of including things into the category that you're defining, the category of cats, then the first definition includes more. Now, that's the sense of including that we actually want to talk about here. If someone defines a cat as just an animal, then that includes all sorts of things in the category cats that don't belong there. And so that's the definition that's too broad. And really the problem with the definition isn't so much that it includes too much, as if there's just too many animals to call cats. We don't want there to be that many cats. The problem isn't how many there are. The problem is that it incorrectly includes some things as cats, because elephants and dogs and horses are animals, and so they're being shoved into the category of cats, which is wrong. And similarly, the definition cat is a feline animal with stripes and green eyes, the problem isn't that it doesn't include enough, as if somehow we just want more cats. Like that's not enough things to be cats. It's that it's the wrong things that are being excluded from this definition. So cats that don't have stripes and green eyes, black cat, for example, is being excluded, which is incorrect, right? Because that's a cat. So you can think of a definition that's too broad in terms of incorrectly including things in the category, remember. And a definition that's too narrow is incorrectly excluding things from the category. Now sometimes this can get a little bit difficult to keep straight. So I've come up with a sort of test you can use to determine if a definition is too broad or if it's too narrow. And so the test is this. You can keep this straight in terms of direction. That is, assuming that you have your word on the left and your definition on the right. Then you can start with the definition on the right and proceed from right to left and say to yourself, can I think of one of these that isn't one of these? So in this case, can I think of an animal that isn't a cat? And of course I can. And that's what shows the definition is too broad. So right to left, too broad. Now if we go the other direction, if we start with the word on the left and proceed from left to right to the definition, and we ask the same question, can I think of one of these, in this case a cat, that is not one of those, feline animal with stripes and green eyes, then that shows that the definition is too narrow. So there's a concrete way you can keep this distinction straight. Now let me give you some examples, and I want you to think about whether you think the definition is too broad or too narrow. Suppose somebody defines an uncle, and they say an uncle is someone whose sibling has a child. The answer is that's too broad. You can apply the test I was talking about, and you can say, can I think of someone whose sibling has a child that is not an uncle? Well, an aunt is someone whose sibling has a child, but since she's female, she's not an uncle. So that shows that the definition is too broad. My aunt is being included as in the category of uncles, which is incorrect. How about the next example? Suppose someone else says, an uncle is a man whose brother has a child. This time the definition is too narrow. And you can apply the test I was talking about again to this one. Start from left to right and say, can I think of an uncle who is not a man whose brother has a child? And of course I can, because it could be a man whose sister has a child, right? And that would be an uncle, but not someone whose brother has a child. So that definition is too narrow. Now take a look at the next proposed definition of uncle. Someone says an uncle is someone whose brother has a child. Someone whose brother has a child. Now this definition is both too broad and too narrow. Yes, a definition can be both too broad and too narrow. maybe the choice of terminology wasn't the greatest whenever someone decided it would be called too broad and too narrow, because, of course, if you have like a board or something, it can't be both too broad and also too narrow. But those terms have been in use for a long time. And unfortunately, a definition can be both too broad and too narrow. If you just think about this definition, you could apply the test for too broad. Can I think of someone whose brother has a child that's not an uncle? And yes, there can be a woman whose brother has a child, and then she's not an uncle because she's an aunt. You can also apply the test for too narrow by proceeding from left to right. Can I think of an uncle who is not someone whose brother has a child? Yes, because I can think of an uncle who is a man whose sister has a child, and that makes him an uncle, but he's not someone whose brother has a child. So the definition is also too narrow. So this definition is both too broad and too narrow. Now, when a definition is too broad or too narrow or both, that's a very concrete way in which the definition is just plain wrong. So this is a really important rule for definitions, and one that I want to place particular emphasis on. It's also the case that the kind of thinking involved in distinguishing too broad and too narrow is very important for logical thought, and something we're going to spend more time with later in the semester. So it's pretty important that you spend some time thinking about this distinction. Now that we've talked about a definition being too broad or too narrow, we can look at Rule 2, which was that a definition should convey the essential meaning of the term being defined. And if a definition is too broad or too narrow, or both, then of course, as we said, it's just plain wrong, and so it doesn't convey the essential meaning. A definition that breaks Rule 3 automatically would break Rule 2 as well. But you could have a definition that doesn't break Rule 3. That is to say, it doesn't miscategorize anything. It gets the categories, it places the right things in the category. But this is sort of by accident, because it doesn't actually convey the essential meaning of the term. And a classic example of this comes allegedly from ancient Greek philosophy. There were some philosophers discussing what it means to be human. And this is a notoriously difficult thing to define as a sort of an easy way out, or way to get around the problem. Someone supposedly suggested that we define human as a featherless biped. Now, this definition, as far as categorizing things, bipedal, meaning walking on two legs, and without feathers, characterizes human beings. And the only other bipedal animals are birds, and birds have feathers. So the definition seems to get the categories right. Humans are featherless bipeds, and featherless bipeds are humans. However, it just doesn't seem plausible at all that part of the essential qualities, features that make us human, is that we don't have feathers, or even really that we're bipedal. Now, those don't seem to be the essential qualities. They're features that happen to mark us out, but they're accidental. So a definition shouldn't do that. It should convey the essential meaning of the term being defined. So we have the rule that it should convey the essential meaning, and the rule that the definition should be neither too broad nor too narrow. The fourth rule from the book is that the definition should not be circular. And what we mean by circular most of the time here is that the definition uses a form of the word it's supposed to be defining. So if someone proposes a definition of science, let's say somebody really doesn't know anything about what science is. What is science, they ask. And then they get the answer, well, science is what scientists do. That definition is circular. And the problem with the circular definition here isn't so much an issue of accuracy as with the previous problems. I suppose it's accurate to say that science is what scientists do. But if you don't already know what science is, then it's not going to help you to say it's what scientists do. And you can see why they call this a circular definition, because next the question is going to be, okay, so what do scientists do? To which the answer is going to be, the scientists do science. Right? All right, what is science? And away we go. So a definition should not be circular. And I want to just mention, although it would be sort of impossible to give you examples like this on a test, that in an extended sense of circular definition, we could sometimes call a definition circular if it just gives you a synonym of the term being defined, instead of actually describing it in a little more detail. So if someone says, what is a cockatiel? And then you say, well, cockatiel's a member of the species Nymphicus hollandicus. Then that isn't really going to be helpful in the same way that a circular definition isn't helpful. You've just given me just a synonym for the same thing, and you didn't go into the description of it's a type of bird and describe the bird and so on. So in an extended sense of circular, we might call that kind of definition circular too, but that's kind of a vague sense of a definition being circular, because at some point when you give a definition, your description of the term is supposed to mean the same thing that the term means. So in a way, all definitions are circular like that, but exactly how uninformative they are is sort of a vague boundary. So for exercise purposes and for testing purposes, we'll just stick to the notion of circular definition as using a form of the word being defined. The next rule for definitions is that the definition should not be negative unless it's unavoidable. And what we mean by negative here isn't that it makes the thing being defined sound bad, like when we were talking about a persuasive definition. Here, what's meant by negative is that instead of telling you what the thing is, it tells you what it's not. So if I was going to give you a definition of what a car was, what an automobile is, and I said that it's a carriage without a horse, that there's no horse pulling it, then that's not exactly the most helpful kind of explanation I could give you of what a car is. It would be better if I told you what it is, that it has an engine that's self-propelling or something like that, some kind of description of that, as opposed to saying that it's a horseless carriage, although people did call cars horseless carriages at first. Sometimes it's okay for a definition to be negative because it's unavoidable. It's just the meaning of the word is something is lacking or missing. Like the word bald means someone that doesn't have much hair or any at all. And it's not like, oh, that definition's negative. Tell me what bald means. Not tell me what a bald person is, not what they're not, right? But that's just sort of how the word is defined. So it's unavoidable in that case. Now, this is a good rule, but not one that's easy to come up with test examples about. So I'm going to kind of leave this rule in the background. We won't focus too much on this rule. Although, again, there will be examples in the exercises that have to do with some of these rules that I'm leaving out, and that one in particular. That's a more significant rule, but I think we better leave it out. Let's proceed to the next rule, which is Rule 6. And Rule 6 says that the definition should avoid figurative, vague, or obscure language. And you may notice that Rule 6 is actually 3 rules, not just 1 rule, because those are 3 different things, right? Figurative, vague, obscure. Those are 3 different things. And the part about the vague or obscure language, I want to just not worry too much about, because what if something is difficult to define without using obscure language? And what if a word just is vague? So then we have to get into cases where it should be avoided. Let's just focus on the first part of Rule 6, that the definition should avoid figurative language. And I would put it by saying that the definition should be literal. It should make a sincere attempt to explain what the word or phrase means. And it shouldn't give us some kind of catchphrase or some kind of analogy that's supposed to somehow capture the meaning in a figurative way or in some kind of catchy way. So, for example, if someone asks, what is education? You want a serious definition of education. And the response is, well, education is the mind freeing itself from the jails of ignorance. Right? I mean, this is not a serious attempt to just explain what the thing is. I mean, it's some kind of metaphor and it's supposed to be inspirational somehow, but it doesn't actually just literally sit down and try and come up with an explanation of what education means. So that's not really what we want. So Rule 6, that the definition should avoid figurative language, that's another significant one. Rule 7 says that the definition should avoid affective language. And what the book means by affective there, don't confuse that with effective. It doesn't mean that, definition shouldn't work. Affective can mean having an effect on the emotions. So if I give a definition that says, matrimony is the pinnacle of human existence and the highest and holiest sacrament, all this praising and glorifying of marriage isn't really part of explaining what it is here. So that's affective language. So in other words, the definition should not be a persuasive definition. Now, this is an important rule about lexical definitions, but it's sort of redundant because we already covered this when we talked about persuasive definitions, that it's not a good thing when a definition is persuasive. So I propose to leave that rule sort of in the background as well. Again, there will be examples in the exercises, but I don't want to focus on it. And the last rule, Rule 8, that the definition should state the context in which the definition applies. So, for example, if someone's defining strike, they shouldn't just say, strike is when the batter misses the ball, because it can mean that in baseball, that's what it means. And, in bowling, it means something else. And then, mixed martial arts, strike is something else too. So that's a significant rule in a way. I want to leave that rule in the background too. It could be more or less important depending on what's being defined. So at this point, we've kind of pared the list of rules for definitions down to just 4 that we're going to really focus on. And those are that the definition should convey the essential meaning of the term being defined, that it should be neither too broad nor too narrow, that it should not be circular, and that it should avoid figurative language, that it should be literal. So I want you to focus on those 4 rules when you go through the examples in section 2.5. And when it comes time to give you a test on this material, I'm only going to test you on these 4 rules.